Check the scrapyard, sweetheart. Parker laughed, tossing a $20 bill at the vagrant questioning his engine specs. He didn't recognize the CEO behind the pilled hoodie. He didn't know the property deed was in her pocket. Now the clock is ticking. Violet is about to turn his high-fashion world into a professional graveyard. One insult just liquidated $1 billion legacy. Would you show mercy or make them pay? Comment justice below to unlock the next chapter of Violet's revenge. If you crave stories where the arrogant finally get what's coming to them, subscribe and join the inner circle. Don't let the shadow leave you behind. Hit that notification bell now. The blue light of the monitors cast a ghostly pallor over Violet's face, sharpening the high, elegant lines of her cheekbones. In the silent sanctuary of her private office, the world outside her glass and steel empire felt like a distant, chaotic dream. But on the screen before her, the reality was stark and ugly. She watched the high-definition feed from her flagship boutique on Fifth Avenue, leaning forward until her breath fogged the glass of her desk. The man on the screen didn't belong in the gilded world of high fashion. He wore a faded army jacket, its edges frayed and stained by years of hard use, and he moved with a slight rhythmic limp that spoke of old wounds. He wasn't there to buy a $5,000 suit. He was simply seeking a moment of warmth, his hands trembling as he reached toward the vent near the entrance. Violet watched, her jaw tightening as two of her floor managers approached. They didn't offer a hand or a word of kindness. Instead, they stood like sentinels of exclusion, their body language radiating a cold, polished disdain. They ushered him back toward the spinning glass doors, treating him not as a human being, but as a smudge on the pristine aesthetic of the brand. Violet felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in her chest. She had built this world to be perfect, but she had never intended for it to be cruel. The billionaire's shadow was a nickname the press loved to use, a nod to her private nature and her habit of appearing where she was least expected, but in this moment the shadow felt literal, a darkness creeping into the very heart of her legacy. She watched the veteran disappear into the gray afternoon sleet of Manhattan, his shoulders hunched against the wind, and for the first time in a decade, the weight of her silk blouse felt suffocating. She stood up, the leather of her chair creaking in the silence. She didn't call her assistant. She didn't summon the managers for a reprimand. A memo wouldn't fix the rot she had just witnessed. To understand how her vision had become so distorted, she couldn't view it from the top of the tower anymore. She needed to see the world as he saw it. Walking toward the hidden closet behind her desk, she bypassed the rows of designer labels. She reached for a simple, nondescript bag she hadn't opened in years. It was time for a transformation that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with truth. The shadow was stepping out of the office, and the city had no idea she was coming. The transition was not merely a change of clothes, it was a systematic dismantling of power. Violet stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her private dressing room, the soft glow of the recessed lighting feeling suddenly too clinical, too revealing. On the velvet ottoman lay the discarded remains of CEO Violet, a tailored charcoal blazer that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, a pair of Italian silk trousers, and the heavy mechanical heartbeat of her Patek Philippe watch. Stripped of these talismans, she felt a strange, light-headed vulnerability, as if she were shedding her very skin. She reached for the items she had procured with purposeful anonymity. The jeans were heavy denim, worn thin at the knees and frayed at the hems, not the curated expensive distress of a luxury brand, but the genuine erosion of labor and time. She pulled them on, the fabric rough against skin accustomed to Egyptian cotton. Next came a charcoal hoodie, oversized and slightly pilled, and a pair of scuffed leather boots that lacked the sharp, aggressive click of her usual stilettos. Finally, she tucked her honey blonde hair, usually blown out into a weaponized sheet of perfection, under a dark wool baker boy hat. She pulled the brim low, shadowing the eyes that usually commanded boardrooms. When she looked back at the glass, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. The reflection was a ghost, a regular Violet who lacked the invisible aura of $1 billion net worth. Without the sharp lines of her designer silhouette, she looked smaller, softer, and infinitely more dismissible. It was a jarring realization. The world hadn't been respecting her all these years, it had been respecting the costume. The deference she received at five-star restaurants, the way doors seemed to swing open by some magnetic force of her presence, the way people lowered their voices when she entered a room, all of it was tied to the fabric, the brand, and the price tag. She practiced a slight slouch, a rounding of the shoulders that signaled a lack of expectation. It was an experiment in invisibility. In her high-rise office, she was the sun around which 1,000 employees orbited. On the street, dressed like this, she would be just another obstacle to be stepped around. The veteran she had seen on the monitor hadn't been ignored because he was invisible. He was ignored because he was perceived as a deficit to the environment. Violet realized with a sharp, stinging clarity that if she walked into her own boutique right now, the managers she paid wouldn't even offer her a glass of water. They would likely offer her the exit. This transformation was her Trojan horse. She wasn't just going to watch her empire, she was going to haunt it. The afternoon sun caught the aggressive, predatory lines of the white Ferrari Roma parked squarely in the executive VIP berth. Sat there like a throne of ivory and carbon fiber, a testament to the obscene bonuses Violet herself had signed off on just last quarter. She stood at the edge of the curb, the wind whipping the hem of her oversized hoodie, watching the way the light danced off the pristine ceramic coating. It was a beautiful machine, but in the context of the veteran she had seen earlier, the man who couldn't even find a vent for warmth, it looked like a monument to vanity. Violet stepped forward, her scuffed leather boots crunching on the gravel that was kept meticulously clear of debris. She reached out a hand, her fingers hovering inches from the door handle. She wanted to feel the cold, unforgiving reality of the metal she had helped buy for a man who didn't even recognize her humanity without a designer label. "Don't you even think about it." The voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the ambient hum of the city. Smith Sterling came charging across the pavement, his silk tie flying over his shoulder, his face flushed with a mixture of panic and pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't see the woman who sat at the head of every board meeting he attended. He saw a vagrant, a smudge on his perfect afternoon, a threat to his most prized possession. He reached her in 3 strides, placing his body between Violet and the car as if shielding a child from a predator. "Get back." "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his eyes darting to the door handle to check for phantom fingerprints. He looked her up and down, his lip curling in a sneer that transformed his handsome features into something grotesque. "You have no business being in this lot, let alone touching this vehicle." Violet didn't move. She looked him directly in the eye, her expression unreadable under the low brim of her baker boy hat. She wondered if he could see the CEO Violet behind the shadow of the brim, but Smith was too blinded by his own sense of superiority to look that deep. "I was just looking," she said, her voice intentionally softened, stripped of its usual command. "Looking costs more than you make in a year," Smith snapped, his voice rising in pitch. He gestured wildly at the car's gleaming hood. "You can't afford the wax job on this car, let alone the engine. People like you don't belong near things like this. It's a Ferrari, not a public bench. Now move along before I have security drag you off the property for trespassing." He turned his back on her then, pulling a microfiber cloth from his pocket to buff a spot of dust that only he could see. The dismissiveness was absolute. Violet stood there for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with a truth Smith was light years away from grasping. She had given him the world, and he was using it to build a wall against the very person who provided it. The billionaire's shadow had never felt more substantial or more dangerous. The afternoon air grew colder, but Violet didn't retreat. Instead, she pivoted away from Smith's frantic buffing and moved toward Parker Peterson, who had finally stepped out of the lobby to join the spectacle. He was leaning against a sleek bollard, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched his colleague defend the Ferrari. He looked at Violet not with the burning rage Smith possessed, but with a weary, entertained condescension, as if she were a stray animal that had wandered onto a movie set. Violet didn't flinch. She tilted her head, her voice steady and stripped of the tremolo she had used moments before. "It's a magnificent piece of engineering," she said, her eyes tracing the air intakes. But I've always wondered about the specific calibration of the $12. Does this model still struggle with the low-end torque displacement, or did they finally refine the intake manifold to handle the $800 horsepower without that slight lag in the third gear? The silence that followed was heavy. Parker's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, the technical precision of the question cutting through his internal monologue of superiority. He blinked, looking at the frayed denim of her jeans and the pilled wool of her hat, trying to reconcile the jargon with the person standing in front of him. Then, he let out a sharp, barking laugh that carried across the executive lot, a sound devoid of any real humor. The $12 specs, Parker repeated, shaking his head as he stepped closer, his expensive loafers crunching the gravel with a sense of ownership. Sweetheart, you're reciting lines from a magazine you probably found in a waiting room. You're in the wrong neighborhood for this kind of conversation. Understanding the $dollar requires a level of education and a bank account that you clearly haven't been introduced to. He gestured vaguely toward the industrial district several miles to the east, where the skyline turned from glass towers to rusted corrugated steel. If you're looking for something with 4 wheels and an engine in your budget, I'd suggest you check the scrapyard. They might have a beat-up sedan with a leaking radiator that's more your speed. This car is a symphony, you're barely a dial tone. Violet watched him, her expression a mask of calm that would have terrified him if he knew who was behind it. Parker reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, flicking it toward her with a careless toss. Fluttered through the air, landing near her scuffed boot. There. Go buy yourself a coffee and find a bus stop. Some of us actually have empires to run. He turned to Smith, sharing a conspiratorial roll of the eyes, already dismissing her existence before the bill had even settled in the dust. Violet looked down at the money, then back at the 2 men she had empowered. The billionaire's shadow was no longer just a disguise, it was a verdict. They had failed the test of character she hadn't even known she was giving, and the cost of their arrogance was about to be far higher than a wax job. The $20 bill lay in the dirt like a fallen leaf, a small green monument to Parker's arrogance. Violet stared at it, the weight of her dual existence pulling at her chest. Behind her, she could hear the muffled, self-congratulatory laughter of the 2 men as they walked back toward the glass doors of the lobby, their silhouettes framed by the setting sun that turned the corporate tower into a pillar of gold. The world was cold, sharp-edged, and utterly indifferent to the woman in the frayed jeans. Then, the heavy thud of a service door swinging open broke the silence. A young man, perhaps no older than 22, emerged from the side entrance of the parking garage. He was draped in a utilitarian navy jumpsuit that swallowed his thin frame, the fabric stained with the honest grime of a long shift. He carried a heavy plastic bucket and a mop, his shoulders slumped with a fatigue that Violet recognized from her own early days of building something out of nothing. He stopped when he saw her. He had witnessed the tail end of the exchange, the flick of the money, the sneer on Smith's face, the way Parker had treated her like a piece of unwanted furniture. He didn't look at her with the clinical judgment of a branding expert or the defensive territorialism of a vice president. He looked at her with the tired, clear eyes of someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be invisible. Setting his bucket down with a soft splash, he approached her, ignoring the keep clear lines of the VIP berths. He didn't look at the Ferrari, he looked at Violet. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small, folding camp chair, the kind the night shift used during their brief breaks in the garage. He set it down on the asphalt a respectful distance from the white car and gestured toward it with a shy, weary smile. "Sit for a minute, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "The concrete's cold this time of year, and you look like you've had a long walk." Violet hesitated, her hands still tucked into the pocket of her pilled hoodie. "I'm fine," she murmured, though the kindness in his tone nearly cracked the foundation of her composure. The young man shook his head, glancing toward the glass doors where the shadows of Smith and Parker had disappeared. "Don't mind them," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They think the world ends at the edge of their own reflection. But for what it's worth, I think you look great standing next to that car. You actually look like you'd know what to do with all that power instead of just dusting it with a silk rag. He reached down, picked up the $20 bill from the dirt, and held it out to her with a clean corner of his hand. You dropped this. Don't let them keep it. It's a long way to the station, and you might need it more than they need the ego boost. In that moment, the billionaire's shadow felt the first true warmth it had encountered all day. It wasn't the heat of a high-rise office or the glow of a stock ticker. It was the simple, unadorned light of human decency. Violet reached out and took the bill, her fingers brushing his calloused hand. She realized then that while she had been looking for rot in her empire, she had found its only remaining soul in the person she usually paid the least. The warmth of the young man's kindness was still settling in the air when the heavy glass doors of the flagship entrance hissed open once more. This time, the silence that followed wasn't a wall, it was a vacuum. Camila Wilson, the director of retail experience, a woman whose entire career was built on the curation of perfection, stepped onto the pavement. Her heels, sharp enough to draw blood, clicked against the stone in a rapid, aggressive staccato that signaled a brewing storm. She didn't look at the young janitor, who instinctively moved back toward his bucket, his brief moment of rebellion flickering out under her icy gaze. Camila's focus was singular and lethal. She marched toward Violet, her nostrils flaring as she took in the scene, the scuffed boots, the frayed denim, and the $20 bill still clutched in Violet's hand. To Camila, this wasn't just a person, it was a pathogen. "This is unacceptable," Camila began, her voice a low, vibrating hum of suppressed fury. She didn't wait for a response. She stepped into Violet's personal space, the scent of her expensive, floral perfume clashing violently with the smell of city exhaust and the janitor's cleaning supplies. "You are quite literally ruining the aesthetic for the real clients who are paying for an experience. Do you have any idea how much money passes through those doors every hour? People don't come here to see this." She gestured toward Violet's outfit with a flick of her wrist that suggested she was discarding a piece of trash. Her eyes were hard, polished stones. "I've watched you on the security feed for the last 10 minutes. First the loitering near the Ferrari, and now this pathetic display of panhandling with the maintenance staff. You are a visual blight on this property." Violet stood her ground, her face still partially obscured by the shadow of her hat, but her pulse was beginning to steady into something cold and crystalline. "I wasn't aware that standing on a public sidewalk was a crime against fashion," she said softly. Camila's laugh was a sharp, brittle thing. "This isn't a public sidewalk. This is an entrance to an empire. And I am the gatekeeper. You have exactly 30 seconds to disappear before I call the police and have you processed for loitering and harassment. We have a brand to protect, and that brand doesn't include people who look like they belong in a soup kitchen." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the corner of the block, her face contorted in a mask of professional disgust. "Move. Now. Before I make sure you spend the night in a cell where your aesthetic will fit right in." Violet looked at the finger, then back at the woman she had once praised for her attention to detail. The detail Camila had missed, however, was the human being standing right in front of her. The billionaire's shadow had seen enough. The transformation was complete, but the revelation was only just beginning. The air in the executive lot seemed to crystallize, turning brittle under the weight of Camila's outstretched finger. Smith and Parker remained hovered by the glass doors, their faces twisted into masks of bored amusement as they watched the nuisance finally being handled. The young janitor had retreated to the shadows of the garage, his head bowed, the only person in the vicinity who had treated a fellow human as something more than a visual error. Violet didn't move toward the street. Instead, she reached into the deep, pilled pocket of her charcoal hoodie. Her fingers brushed past the $20 bill the boy had given her and settled on a heavy, cream-colored vellum envelope that had been folded once, sharply. As she pulled it out, the high-grade paper caught the dying light of the sun, its texture screaming of a world far removed from the scrapyard Parker had suggested. Camila's eyes narrowed, her sneer deepening. "What is that? A citation? A plea for a job?" Violet didn't answer. She unfolded the paper with a slow, deliberate precision that caused the rustle of the vellum to sound like a gunshot in the sudden silence. She held it up, not for Camila to take, but for her to see. The top, the embossed gold seal of the state, sat above the original property deed and the corporate charter of the Sterling Vane conglomerate. At the very bottom, in a bold, uncompromising script that had authorized every one of their salaries, was a single signature, Violet Vane. "You were right about one thing, Camila," Violet said, her voice no longer soft or hesitant. It had regained the resonant, predatory edge that had carved an empire out of thin air. She reached up and pulled the baker boy hat from her head, letting her honey-blonde hair fall in a shimmering curtain over her shoulders. "The aesthetic of this company is being ruined. But it isn't the clothes. It's the rot in the leadership." Camila's face drained of color so quickly it looked like a physical blow. Beside the Ferrari, Smith dropped his microfiber cloth into the dirt, his jaw hanging slack. Parker, who had been leaning casually against the bollard, stood bolt upright, his hands beginning to tremble as he realized the dial tone he had laughed at was the woman who owned his career. Violet didn't look at their terror. She lifted her left wrist, pulling back the sleeve of the cheap hoodie to reveal the $100,000 Patek Philippe she had hidden there, a timepiece that kept the only rhythm that mattered in this building. "It's exactly 4 p.m., Violet stated, her gaze sweeping over the three of them like a scythe. "Which means the emergency board meeting I called from my phone 10 minutes ago has just started. You're all late." She stepped toward the glass doors, the authority in her stride making them instinctively scramble out of her path. "But don't worry about the agenda. You aren't there to discuss the spring campaign or the $12 specs. You're all just in time for your exit interviews. Security will meet you at your desks to oversee the clearing of your personal effects." She paused at the threshold, looking back at the young janitor in the navy jumpsuit. "And you," she said, her voice softening just a fraction, "put the mop away. I need a new head of guest relations who actually remembers what it's like to be human. Follow me." Without a backward glance at the ruins of their reputations, Violet Vane stepped back into her empire, the shadow finally yielding to the light. The silence in the lobby was no longer the calculated stillness of luxury, it was the suffocating vacuum of a disaster in progress. Violet stood in the center of the marble floor, the frayed cuffs of her hoodie pushed back to reveal the watch that governed the building's heartbeat. She pulled a sleek, encrypted device from her pocket and tapped a single icon. "Marcus," she said, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with a terrifying clarity. "I'm in the flagship lobby. Deactivate the credentials for Sterling, Peterson, and Wilson. Effective immediately. They are to be escorted from the premises. No personal devices, no files, no exceptions. And have the cleaning crew scrub the executive lot. There's some trash by the Ferrari." The sound of 3 simultaneous electronic chirps rang out, the hollow digital death knell of their security badges. Camila reached for her throat as if her silk scarf had suddenly become a noose, her eyes darting to the glass doors she had just tried to force Violet through. Smith gripped his car keys so hard his knuckles turned white, realizing the white Ferrari was now sitting in a lot he no longer had the right to stand on. Parker simply stared at his hands, the $20 bill he had tossed in the dirt now a haunting symbol of the cheapest mistake of his life. Violet ignored their gasps and the frantic, whispered pleas that began to bubble up as the reality of their ruin set in. She turned her back on the architects of exclusion and looked toward the young man in the navy jumpsuit. He was still standing by his bucket, his expression a mixture of shock and a dawning, quiet triumph. "What's your name?" she asked, her tone stripping away the iron of the CEO to reveal the woman who had once been just as invisible as he was. "Leo, ma'am," he stammered, wiping his hands on his thighs. "Leo Vance." Violet reached into the hidden pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a heavy, matte-black business card embossed with the company's private crest. She stepped forward and placed it firmly in his hand, her gaze steady and encouraging. "Well, Leo, I think you've spent enough time behind a mop. Starting now, you're the new floor manager of this flagship. Your first task is to find the veteran who was here earlier this afternoon. If he's still within 10 blocks, find him, bring him back, and give him whatever he needs, not as a charity case but as a guest of honor. She looked at the three executives being led away by a phalanx of security guards, their faces pale and humiliated as they were marched past the very employees they had spent years belittling. "You told me I looked like I knew what to do with power," Violet said to Leo, a small, sharp smile playing on her lips. "Now I'm giving you a piece of it. Let's show them how we treat people here. The aesthetic is changing, and it starts with a handshake, not a price tag." As she walked toward the elevators, the billionaire's shadow didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt like a blueprint. She had torn down the mirrors, and for the first time in a long time, she liked exactly what she saw.